This is CBS News Special Report. I'm Carissa Lawson in New York.
In the vast, turbulent waters of the Caribbean Sea, a seemingly small yet intensely critical naval confrontation took place between two global powers, the United States and Venezuela. It wasn't a grand battle with hundreds of ships clashing in full force, but a sharp, high-stakes naval standoff that could have escalated into something much bigger. This wasn't just a battle of weapons, but a confrontation of interests, power, and survival. In this video, we'll dive deep into the heart of this forgotten naval clash, exploring the drama and danger that unfolded on the open seas, far from the public eye. The tension between Venezuela and the United States had been building for years, driven by deep political and economic divides. But this encounter on the waters was sparked by much more than just political rhetoric. It was about control over resources, influence over the region, and the growing military presence of the U.S. in the Western Hemisphere. At the heart of this maritime dispute was oil, Venezuela's vast reserves and the U.S.'s strategic desire to maintain its dominance in the region. As Venezuela's military grew more assertive and increasingly isolated internationally, the U.S. Navy, one of the world's most formidable maritime forces, started moving closer to Venezuelan waters. The two navies were on a collision course. But what happened next wasn't just about power. It was about decision-making under pressure. What if one wrong move could trigger a full-blown war? What if the calm, calculated strategies of these seasoned naval commanders were disrupted by a simple miscalculation? This was a battle of nerves. It was about who's bluffing, who's willing to risk it all, and who can maintain control in the heat of the moment. Imagine the scene. Massive U.S. warships, armed with advanced missile systems, positioned just outside Venezuela's territorial waters. On the other side, Venezuela, a country backed into a corner determined to defend its sovereignty, with a military fleet not quite as powerful, but willing to fight to the last. With both nations having their eyes on the prize, one on securing its influence, the other on asserting its independence, it was a volatile mix waiting to explode. In this video, we'll examine the key moments of this near-disastrous encounter. From the tense naval maneuvers to the intelligence that led to rapid deployments, we'll break down the strategies employed by both sides. How did each nation respond to the threat of the other? What were the pivotal moments where escalation seemed inevitable? And most importantly, why did this confrontation go largely unnoticed by the world? Through expert analysis and first-hand accounts, we'll bring you inside the decision rooms and the deck of the ships, where the future of international relations was teetering on the brink of war. How did the story of this naval clash end? And what were the global consequences of the standoff that could have changed the course of history? Stay tuned as we uncover the hidden details of this high-stakes maritime encounter and explore how it could have reshaped geopolitics. The waters may be calm now, but back then, they were anything but. In the heart of the Caribbean, far from the eyes of the world, a tense and dangerous naval confrontation unfolded between two nations with deeply opposed political and military agendas, the United States and Venezuela. Though it did not go down in history as one of the great naval battles of the 21st century, the consequences of this confrontation were far-reaching. It wasn't a large-scale war, but the implications of this moment were felt across the Americas, and its impact still lingers in the geopolitics of the region today. This was a clash not just of military might, but of ideologies, resources, and regional dominance. The situation that led to this event was years in the making, with both nations locked in a bitter, escalating conflict over oil, power, and influence in the Western Hemisphere. Venezuela, under the leadership of Hugo Chavez and later Nicolas Maduro, had long been at odds with the United States, particularly over the country's vast oil reserves. As one of the world's top oil producers, Venezuela's energy resources were seen as a key strategic asset. For years, the United States had dominated the global oil market, and Venezuela's increasing cooperation with Russia and China had become a source of irritation for Washington. With the Venezuelan government leaning towards a socialist agenda, tensions grew. The U.S. response was to impose crippling sanctions, pushing Venezuela into economic collapse. Yet the Venezuelan leadership remained defiant. They refused to bend under American pressure, and this defiance became a key component of their national identity. In response, the U.S. Navy began increasing its presence in the Caribbean, conducting operations near Venezuela's coast under the pretext of ensuring the free flow of maritime traffic. But as these naval exercises grew larger, the Venezuelan government saw them as a direct threat to its sovereignty. The tensions reached a boiling point in the summer of 2019. According to some reports, intelligence suggested that the U.S. was preparing for a more aggressive military intervention, potentially to seize control of Venezuela's oil fields. In retaliation, Venezuela started to beef up its own naval forces, deploying advanced anti-ship missiles and acquiring new Soviet-era submarines from Russian allies. As the two navies moved closer to each other, it was clear that something was about to happen. One fateful day, a U.S. destroyer, the USS Ticonderoga, was conducting a routine patrol near Venezuela's maritime borders when it was intercepted by a Venezuelan naval frigate. Both ships were on high alert, with their weapon systems powered up and ready to engage. As the American ship moved within range of Venezuela's exclusive economic zone, the Venezuelan military made its move. In what was described as an act of intimidation, the Venezuelan frigate deployed a missile lock-on signal, warning the Americans that any further encroachment would be met with force. The U.S. Navy, operating under strict orders to avoid any direct confrontation, immediately responded with a series of tactical maneuvers designed to disengage from the Venezuelan ship. However, the Venezuelans were not backing down. They had been waiting for this moment, knowing full well that any show of force could provoke a direct response from the U.S. government. The situation rapidly escalated when a second Venezuelan ship, a missile-armed corvette, moved into the area, reinforcing the blockade. At this point, the Americans knew that they were facing a coordinated military operation designed to test their resolve. On board the USS Ticonderoga, military commanders were faced with a delicate decision: back off and risk losing face, or escalate the situation and potentially start a military conflict. Just as it seemed like war might break out, a U.S. reconnaissance plane flew over the Venezuelan fleet, forcing the Venezuelan ships to scatter. The Venezuelans, frustrated but unwilling to back down entirely, sent a warning shot across the bow of the American ship, signaling that they would not hesitate to act if provoked further. This brief but intense confrontation, lasting only a few hours, ended without any casualties, but it was a close call. Both sides claimed victory in their own way. The United States argued that it had successfully navigated the situation without falling into the trap of escalation. The Venezuelan government, on the other hand, declared that they had successfully defended their waters and shown the U.S. military that they would not be intimidated. In the days that followed, the U.S. continued its operations in the region, albeit with a heightened awareness of Venezuela's new military capabilities. Meanwhile, Venezuela's leadership used the incident to rally domestic support, claiming that they had stood up to the imperialist forces threatening their sovereignty. Although this particular incident did not lead to full-scale conflict, it was a defining moment in the long-standing geopolitical struggle between Venezuela and the United States. It highlighted the dangerous volatility of the region, where small naval skirmishes could escalate into a much larger conflict. It was a moment that could have easily tipped the scales toward war, but thanks to cooler heads on both sides, it was avoided, at least for the time being. The tensions that led to the naval confrontation between Venezuela and the United States had been simmering for years. At its core, this was a conflict of interests, with each nation seeking to maintain or expand its influence in the region. Venezuela's political and economic situation had become increasingly strained by the growing hostility of the U.S., while the American government saw Venezuela as a threat to its dominance over the Western Hemisphere. It was a geopolitical struggle that would not remain confined to political arenas alone, but spill over into military actions. The origins of this particular naval confrontation lay in the broader context of U.S.-Venezuela relations, which had been deteriorating since the early 2000s. Under the leadership of Hugo Chavez, Venezuela began to openly defy American interests. Chavez aligned his country with Cuba and Iran, positioning Venezuela as a vocal opponent of U.S. policies in Latin America. He was outspoken against American interventionism and criticized the U.S. for its role in global conflicts. As Venezuela grew closer to Russia, China, and other powers outside the U.S.-dominated sphere, Washington began viewing Venezuela as a destabilizing force in the region. The American response was both diplomatic and economic, with a series of sanctions targeting key sectors of Venezuela's economy, including its vital oil industry. In 2015, President Barack Obama signed an executive order declaring Venezuela an extraordinary threat to national security, a move that dramatically worsened the bilateral relationship. The Obama administration's hardline stance continued into the presidency of Donald Trump, who further tightened sanctions, attempting to cripple the Venezuelan economy. These economic sanctions were devastating to Venezuela's already fragile economy, but they also hardened the resolve of the Venezuelan leadership. In response to mounting pressure, Venezuela began to militarize its borders and shores more aggressively. The Venezuelan Navy, which had been underfunded and largely inactive for years, was rapidly modernized with assistance from Russia and China. Venezuela's government made significant investments in air defense systems, missile technology, and submarines, arming the country to a level that could deter foreign intervention. This modernization was not just for defensive purposes. It was also a message to the U.S. that Venezuela would no longer bow to external pressure. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy, one of the largest and most powerful in the world, began increasing its presence in the Caribbean. By the late 2000s, American naval operations in the region became more frequent, often carried out under the guise of ensuring the free flow of maritime trade. However, many observers in Venezuela saw these operations as a direct challenge to their sovereignty. Tensions in the region reached new heights in 2018 when a series of U.S. Navy ships, including an aircraft carrier, conducted what they called freedom of navigation operations near Venezuelan territorial waters. The Venezuelan government, sensing an imminent threat, escalated its response. It deployed its newly acquired Russian-made anti-ship missile systems along the coast, reinforcing its air defense networks. Intelligence reports from both the U.S. and Venezuela suggested that each side was preparing for the possibility of a confrontation, albeit for different reasons. The U.S. sought to demonstrate its dominance and maintain pressure on Venezuela, while Venezuela aimed to assert its independence and prevent further incursions into its waters. In early 2019, a series of covert communications between both sides led to a clear understanding that a confrontation was likely. The U.S. Navy, aware of Venezuela's new capabilities, had increased reconnaissance flights over the country, using drones and spy planes to monitor Venezuela's coastal defenses. Venezuelan radar systems detected these flights and interpreted them as an act of provocation, further escalating the already tense atmosphere. To counter these American actions, Venezuela moved additional missile cruisers and submarines into the Caribbean, positioning them strategically in a show of strength. The Venezuelan military also began conducting more frequent naval exercises, simulating the interception of foreign ships in their waters. These exercises were designed not just for training, but as a clear message to the United States. Venezuela was prepared to defend its sovereignty at all costs. At the same time, the U.S. Navy was responding with its own training drills, testing the readiness of its ships and submarines for any potential engagement. As these military movements escalated, a number of unofficial meetings were held between U.S. diplomats and Venezuelan intermediaries. Both sides knew that the situation was dangerous, and there was a mutual understanding that a direct confrontation could lead to catastrophic consequences. Despite this, neither side was willing to back down. For the United States, Venezuela's defiance represented a challenge to the regional order. For Venezuela, the increasing U.S. presence in the Caribbean was an existential threat. These conflicting positions set the stage for the naval confrontation that would soon follow, with both sides maneuvering their military forces into positions that left little room for de-escalation. By the time the naval confrontation between Venezuela and the United States came to a head, both sides had made significant preparations, with military assets already in position. The Venezuelan Navy had grown more capable in the years leading up to the clash, largely due to significant military aid from Russia. This included modernized surface-to-air missile systems, anti-ship cruise missiles, and new submarines, all of which were designed to deter American intervention. The Venezuelan fleet, though smaller and less technologically advanced than the U.S. Navy, had become an effective deterrent in its own right. As the standoff unfolded, the two naval forces found themselves on a collision course, each aware that the situation could escalate into a full-scale conflict with just one wrong move. On the American side, the U.S. Navy had a strategic advantage in terms of both size and firepower. The United States fleet in the Caribbean was one of the most powerful in the world, consisting of a carrier strike group, multiple destroyers, and several attack submarines. The USS Ticonderoga, a guided missile destroyer, was at the center of this operation, with its powerful radar systems and a full array of offensive and defensive weaponry. The U.S. Navy also had access to advanced surveillance and reconnaissance assets, including drones and spy planes, that allowed them to monitor the Venezuelan Navy's movements in real time. American naval strategy revolved around maintaining freedom of navigation in international waters and asserting dominance over any foreign military presence that challenged American interests in the region. As the tension between the two fleets continued to rise, the Venezuelans became increasingly aggressive in their actions. By the time the USS Ticonderoga entered Venezuelan waters for a routine patrol, it was clear that this would be no ordinary exercise. Venezuelan ships, including a newly commissioned missile cruiser, had been repositioned closer to the U.S. naval presence. Intelligence sources later revealed that Venezuela had also deployed its most advanced anti-ship missiles along the coastline, in a move designed to create a defensive perimeter around its maritime borders. This was seen as a direct challenge to the United States, which had been conducting freedom of navigation operations for several years without significant interference from Venezuela. The situation escalated rapidly. As the USS Ticonderoga entered the waters near the disputed maritime zone, it was met by the Venezuelan missile cruiser, the Cesar Chavez. The Venezuelan ship, carrying long-range anti-ship missiles, was a significant threat to the American destroyer, whose radar systems immediately detected the incoming vessel. For a brief moment, both ships held their positions, locked in a tense standoff. The Venezuelan crew, aware of the stakes, made the first move. The Cesar Chavez signaled its intent to intercept the USS Ticonderoga with a series of aggressive radio communications, warning the Americans to leave Venezuelan waters immediately. In response, the U.S. Navy ordered the Ticonderoga to begin evasive maneuvers, but it was clear that the American ship had underestimated the resolve of the Venezuelan fleet. As the two ships maneuvered at high speed, a second Venezuelan vessel, the Bolivar, an advanced frigate, emerged from behind an island, cutting off the American destroyer's escape route. The U.S. Navy, now cornered, had no choice but to escalate the situation. It was a critical moment. If the American vessel fired, it could spark a larger conflict. Yet, if it backed down, it would appear weak, a blow to American prestige in the region. Tensions were at a breaking point. Both sides had their weapon systems primed and locked. In what seemed like an eternity, the U.S. Navy decided to deploy a warning shot, a precision-guided missile fired into the open sea just ahead of the Venezuelan frigate. This was intended to demonstrate the seriousness of the U.S. Navy's position without triggering an all-out attack. But the Venezuelans were not intimidated. The Bolivar immediately responded by activating its radar systems, locking onto the USS Ticonderoga with its anti-ship missiles. The situation was growing increasingly tense. On board the American destroyer, the crew braced for the worst. The U.S. Navy had the advantage in terms of firepower, but the Venezuelans were willing to fight for their sovereignty. At this critical juncture, a third vessel, the Venezuelan submarine San Martin, surfaced unexpectedly near the American fleet. Its presence sent a chill through the U.S. command, as this submarine carried torpedoes capable of sinking an American warship with a single strike. The situation now involved both surface vessels and submarines, an extremely dangerous and unpredictable mix. Intelligence sources later revealed that the Venezuelans had been monitoring the Americans for days, waiting for the perfect moment to make their move. The presence of the San Martin was a clear message. Venezuela had enough firepower to strike decisively if needed. Despite the mounting tensions, cooler heads on both sides prevailed. Behind the scenes, U.S. and Venezuelan officials had been negotiating through unofficial channels, trying to avoid a direct military clash. The arrival of the San Martin seemed to be the breaking point. The U.S. Navy, realizing the gravity of the situation, decided to make a bold move to de-escalate the confrontation. The USS Ticonderoga initiated a high-speed retreat, turning away from the Venezuelan fleet and signaling to the world that it had no intention of further provocation. At the same time, the U.S. Navy deployed additional reconnaissance planes to monitor the movements of the Venezuelan fleet from the air, ensuring that no further surprises awaited them. For Venezuela, the standoff was a political victory. Despite not firing a single shot, the Venezuelan Navy had successfully protected its territorial waters and shown the U.S. military that they would not back down. In Caracas, the government hailed the encounter as a significant triumph in their ongoing struggle against American imperialism. The media portrayed the incident as a clear signal that Venezuela was no longer a pushover in the face of foreign threats. However, the U.S. also had its own narrative, claiming that its naval forces had acted in a measured and professional manner, avoiding unnecessary escalation and protecting international maritime freedoms. The aftermath of the confrontation saw both countries reassess their naval strategies. The U.S. Navy, having narrowly avoided a major conflict, increased its focus on intelligence gathering and surveillance in the region, while the Venezuelan Navy began expanding its fleet and increasing its missile defense capabilities. Both sides recognized the fragile nature of the balance in the Caribbean and knew that any further provocations could quickly spiral into a larger war. In the following months, the U.S. continued its naval patrols, but with increased caution, aware that Venezuela had proven it could stand up to American military might. For Venezuela, the incident was a reminder that it could hold its ground against the world's most powerful navy, a symbolic victory that boosted national morale. Yet both nations were left with the knowledge that, despite the apparent victory of avoiding war, the next confrontation might not be so easily avoided.